My name is Corinne. I am 32 years old. When I was 12, my family packed up their entire lives and moved to New York without me. They left me in a foreclosed apartment in Atlanta with a crisp $50 bill on the kitchen counter and a sticky note that simply read, "You will figure it out." 20 years later, my brother finally searched my name online. Within 24 hours, I had 119 missed calls. Before I reveal what happens next, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. I stood at the podium looking out at a sea of Wall Street executives, venture capitalists, and industry titans. I had just been handed the glass trophy for Innovator of the Year, a recognition of my work building Aegis Financial from a relentless startup into a multi-billion-dollar financial technology empire. The applause was deafening. I wore a tailored emerald green suit that commanded attention, my posture perfectly straight, my expression composed. I was about to begin my acceptance speech when a sudden violent commotion at the back of the ballroom shattered the elegant atmosphere. The heavy mahogany double doors burst open. Two of my private security guards in sharp black suits were struggling to hold back a group of 4 people who were aggressively pushing their way inside. The media section at the side of the room immediately swiveled their cameras toward the disturbance. Camera flashes began to pop like strobe lights. Through the chaos, I saw her first. My mother, Vivica. She was wearing an overly bright sequined dress that looked desperate rather than expensive. She shoved past a security guard and threw herself forward, falling to her knees right on the edge of the red carpet. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving with exaggerated sobs. "Corinne," she wailed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "My baby. Oh, my sweet baby girl. Your father and I have spent 20 years looking for you. We prayed every single day." The reporters went wild. Microphones were thrust forward. The narrative was too good for them to ignore the triumphant reunion of a billionaire CEO and her long-lost family. Behind Vivica stood my father Winston, wearing a stiff suit and an expression of manufactured sorrow. Next to him was my older brother DeAndre, the golden child of the family, adjusting the cuffs of a bespoke jacket that I could immediately tell was bought on credit. And clinging to DeAndre's arm was his wife Sloane, a white woman with a pearl necklace and a posture that screamed generational wealth, even though her eyes darted around the room with the frantic energy of someone drowning in debt. I did not gasp. I did not drop my trophy. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked down at the woman putting on the performance of a lifetime. I raised my hand and caught the eye of my head of security, David. "Clear the press," I said into the microphone, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Turn off the cameras and empty this room immediately." The security team moved with military precision. Despite the protests of the journalists, the ballroom was swiftly cleared. The heavy doors were pulled shut and the heavy brass latches clicked into place. The moment the final click echoed through the empty ballroom, a miraculous transformation occurred. Vivica stopped crying. She did not sniffle or wipe her eyes. She simply stood up, dusted off the knees of her sequined dress, and smoothed her hair. The mask of the grieving mother vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating expression I remembered from my childhood. Winston cleared his throat, stepping up beside her and crossing his arms to puff out his chest. DeAndre let out a breath and offered me a familiar, arrogant smirk. "Well," Vivica said, her voice entirely flat and demanding, "you certainly made it hard to find you, changing your last name, burying your records. But we saw your face on the cover of the Financial Times last week. You have done very well for yourself, Corinne." I set my glass trophy down on the podium. I crossed my arms and stared at them. "You crashed my award ceremony after 20 years just to tell me you read a magazine." "Let us skip the pleasantries," DeAndre interrupted, taking a step forward. He tried to project the aura of a successful hedge fund manager, but I could see the sweat forming at his temples. "My fund is facing a massive margin call on Monday morning. We need liquidity fast." Vivica nodded sharply. "We need $10 million, Corinne. I know you have it. That company of yours is worth billions. 10 million is pocket change for you. You need to write a check to your brother right now to save his firm. The absolute audacity of the demand hung in the air. No apologies, no questions about how I had survived, just an immediate demand for cash. You owe us, Winston barked, pointing a thick finger at me. We gave you life. You are part of this family, and family takes care of its own. It is time for you to pay us back for everything we sacrificed. I looked at the four of them, taking in their desperate, greedy expressions. I let out a slow, chilling laugh that made DeAndre shift uncomfortably on his feet. Pay you back, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You want me to pay you back for your sacrifices? Tell me, Winston, does that $10 million cover the cost of the electricity you shut off before you left me? Vivica rolled her eyes. Do not start with this dramatic nonsense, Corinne. I stepped down from the stage and walked slowly toward them. My heels clicked against the marble floor, matching the steady, furious beating of my heart. I was 12 years old, I said, staring directly into my mother's eyes. I came home from middle school carrying a backpack full of textbooks. I walked up 3 flights of stairs in the sweltering Atlanta heat. When I opened the door to our apartment, the furniture was gone. The television was gone. The beds were gone. You had packed a moving truck while I was sitting in math class. Winston tried to interrupt, but I raised my voice, cutting him down. I walked into the kitchen. I continued, my voice echoing in the large room. The power had already been disconnected. The refrigerator was empty and unplugged. And sitting right in the middle of the cheap Formica counter was a single $50 bill. Next to it was a yellow sticky note in your handwriting. Vivica. Do you remember what it said? My mother looked away, her jaw tight. It said, you will figure it out. I stood there, a 12-year-old child, alone in a dark, empty apartment. You abandoned me to the streets so you could afford to move to New York. So you could afford to send your golden boy here to a private basketball academy. I looked at DeAndre, looking him up and down with utter disgust. Tell me, DeAndre, how did that basketball career work out for you? DeAndre flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. Winston stepped in front of his son, his face contorted with righteous anger. We made the choice we had to make for the future of this family. DeAndre was a prodigy. He was our ticket out of poverty. You were just a sullen, quiet girl who dragged us down. You should be down on your knees thanking us. Thanking you, I asked, tilting my head. Yes, Winston shouted. If we had not left you behind, you never would have learned how to hustle. You never would have gained the grit to build this company. We gave you the greatest gift a parent could give. We made you strong. You owe your entire status as a CEO to our tough love. Now write the check. I stared at the man who contributed half my DNA, amazed at the sheer psychological gymnastics he was performing to justify child abandonment. They genuinely believed their own twisted narrative. They felt no remorse. They only felt entitled to the empire I had bled to build. David. I called out to my head of security without breaking eye contact with my father. Escort these people out of my building. If they resist, have them arrested for trespassing. The security guards moved forward, but before they could lay a hand on my family, Sloane stepped directly into my path. She held up a hand adorned with a massive, albeit slightly cloudy diamond ring. Sloane looked at me with an expression of pure, concentrated disdain. Her posture was rigid with the unearned superiority of a woman who had never worked a day in her life but believed she owned the world. Do not touch us, Sloane snapped at the guards before turning her cold eyes back to me. You are making a very big mistake, Corinne. You think you can just dismiss us like the help. I looked at her. And you are. I am Sloane, she said, lifting her chin, DeAndre's wife. And unlike your family, I come from a lineage that understands how real money works in this city. I know how the game is played, and I know that a little abandoned black girl from the streets of Atlanta does not just magically walk into Wall Street and build a financial empire all by herself. My expression did not change. Is there a point to this racist monologue, Sloane? She smiled, a thin, vicious line across her face. The point is that you are a fraud. When we saw you in the news, my family's legal team did some digging into the origins of Aegis Financial. We looked into how you secured your very first commercial credit line when you were only 18 years old. A teenager with no credit history and no assets does not get a loan of that size. DeAndre smirked behind her, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Sloane took a step closer to me, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. Our lawyers found the original incorporation documents. You used DeAndre's social security number. You forged his signature to secure your first round of funding. You stole your brother's identity to build this company. You owe your entire existence to the credit line DeAndre generously provided, even if he did not know it at the time. I remained completely silent, letting her finish her trap. So here is what is going to happen, Sloane dictated, crossing her arms. You are going to write a check to my husband for $10 million right now to cover his margin call. If you refuse, we are taking those documents straight to the federal authorities. We will press charges for felony identity theft and fraud. And then our lawyers will sue you for 50% of Aegis Financial, since it was built entirely on DeAndre's stolen credit. You can either pay us the $10 million today, or we take half your company tomorrow and send you to prison. The choice is yours. The silence in the room was absolute after Sloane delivered her ultimatum. She stood there with her arms crossed over her chest, her chin tilted upward in a display of unearned superiority. She genuinely believed that her pedigree and her threats held power in my building. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to panic and reach for my checkbook to make the scandal go away. When I did not immediately respond, she took my silence as submission. She took a slow step forward, her expensive heels clicking against the polished marble floor of my boardroom. You need to understand how the real world works, Sloane continued, her voice dripping with that specific brand of Northeastern condescension. People like you do not just magically conquer the financial sector. You are a little black girl who was abandoned on the streets of Atlanta. You have no lineage. You have no generational wealth backing you. The corporate world does not hand out billion-dollar portfolios to charity cases. When DeAndre told me the truth about how your company started, everything finally made sense. He told me how you came crawling to him in New York. He told me how you begged him for help because nobody else would even look at your desperate business proposals. She paced slowly around the edge of the large mahogany table, her eyes raking over my tailored suit with obvious disgust. He felt sorry for you, Sloane said. He used his impeccable credit, his good name and his vast resources to secure that initial commercial loan for you. He practically handed you the keys to your entire existence. And what did you do in return? You cut him out entirely. You took his generous credit line, and you built Aegis Financial while leaving your brilliant brother in the shadows. You owe your entire life to the credit line DeAndre generously provided. Winston stepped up to stand beside his daughter-in-law. My father puffed out his chest, his face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. We always knew you were a thief, Winston sneered. His voice echoed loudly in the cavernous room. From the day you were born, you looked at your brother with nothing but pure envy. DeAndre had the natural talent. DeAndre had the bright future. You could not stand it. So you stole from him. You took his generosity and you claimed it as your own hard work. It is pathetic. You have always been a jealous child who refused to accept her place. Now be a good girl. Sign the equity transfer and give your brother what rightfully belongs to him. Vivica moved closer, her face arranging itself into a mask of fake maternal disappointment. She placed a hand on Winston's arm, playing the role of the peacemaker. Corinne, sweetheart, listen to your father, Vivica said, using that syrupy tone she always deployed when she wanted to manipulate a situation. We do not want to see you go to prison. We do not want to destroy everything you have built. We just want fairness. Your brother is struggling right now, and you are sitting up here in this glass tower, acting like you are better than the people who gave you life. We are your family. We are giving you a chance to make things right before Sloane brings the federal authorities into this. Just sign the papers. Give DeAndre the $10 million and the equity, and we can all walk away from this as a family. I let their words wash over me. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the equity transfer document that Sloane had practically shoved across the table. It was a poorly drafted contract, clearly rushed by whatever desperate attorneys she had managed to retain on her dwindling trust fund budget. They really thought they had me backed into a corner. They really thought I was the same helpless 12-year-old girl they had left behind in an empty apartment. I reached under the edge of the conference table and pressed a small silver button. "You are finished talking now," I asked quietly. Sloane scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Sign the paper, Corinne." The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom opened with a soft click. Marcus, my chief legal officer, stepped into the room. Marcus was a former federal prosecutor. He was a man who possessed a mind like a steel trap and a physical presence that immediately commanded respect in any room he entered. He wore a dark charcoal suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. He walked over to my side of the table and set the briefcase down without making a sound. The sudden shift in the power dynamic in the room was palpable. Winston took a small step backward. DeAndre suddenly looked incredibly nervous, his eyes darting between me and my lawyer. "Marcus," I said smoothly, my voice calm and completely devoid of the fear they were hoping to see. "Please show my guests the foundational loan documents they are referencing." Marcus nodded. He popped the brass latches on his briefcase. He pulled out a pristine preserved copy of a commercial loan agreement and laid it flat on the polished wood table. The document was enclosed in a clear protective sleeve. The date at the top of the paper read October 14th, exactly 15 years ago. Sloane looked at the paper and then smirked at me. "Yes, that is exactly the document," she said triumphantly, pointing a manicured finger at the page. "The $50,000 commercial line of credit. The one DeAndre signed as the primary guarantor to fund your little startup. The one you manipulated him into signing before you locked him out of the company." I stepped closer to the table, resting my fingertips on the cool wood. "Look closer at the signature, Sloane," I said gently. "Look very closely at the guarantor information." Sloane leaned in, her brow furrowing slightly. DeAndre shifted his weight from foot to foot. A fine sheen of sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. He swallowed hard, looking toward the exit doors. "It is a fascinating document," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "A commercial loan for $50,000 secured at a bank in downtown Manhattan, filed under my early limited liability company, but backed entirely by a social security number and a signature. A signature that you claim belongs to DeAndre, given willingly to help his poor, helpless little sister achieve her dreams." "It does belong to me," DeAndre blurted out suddenly. His voice cracked on the last word. "I signed it." "I helped you. Did you?" I asked, tilting my head to look at him. I reached into the open folder that Marcus was holding. I pulled out a second document. This one was much older. The paper was slightly yellowed and the edges of the copy were marked with the official embossed seal of the state of Georgia. It was a juvenile court record. I slid the court record slowly across the polished table until it rested right next to the commercial loan agreement. "It is deeply funny that you claim I came to you in New York to secure this loan," I said, locking eyes with my older brother. "It is funny that you claim I was sitting in a bank lobby with you on October 14th signing these business papers together." Sloane frowned, looking down at the Georgia document. The legal jargon and state seals clearly confused her. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice losing a fraction of its previous arrogance. That I explained calmly is a juvenile detention intake form. "You see, Sloane, on October 14th. 15 years ago, I was not in New York. I was not pitching brilliant business plans to my generous older brother in a Manhattan bank. On that exact day, I was locked inside a freezing holding cell in an Atlanta juvenile detention center." The room went entirely still. The air seemed to get sucked right out of the space. Vivica let out a small strangled gasp. Winston stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. I let the heavy reality of those words settle over them before I continued speaking. "I was picked up by the Atlanta Police Department for vagrancy. I was sleeping on a piece of cardboard behind a grocery store dumpster because the apartment my parents had abandoned me in had finally been boarded up and chained shut by the bank. I was freezing cold. I was starving. I had not eaten a real meal in 4 days. My clothes were filthy and my shoes had holes in them. I was locked in a concrete cell with nothing but a thin paper blanket, crying myself to sleep, terrified out of my mind as a ward of the state, while you were all living comfortably up north in your new house. I looked at Winston and Vivica. Their faces were turning a sickly shade of gray. The blustering confidence they had walked in with was draining out of them by the second. They could not look me in the eye, so I continued turning my attention back to Sloane, whose arrogant posture was rapidly collapsing. It is physically impossible for me to have been in New York on that day. It is physically impossible for me to have signed those loan origination documents with DeAndre. I did not come crawling to him for help. I did not ask him for anything. I did not even know where you people lived. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the table, closing the distance between myself and my brother. I stared directly into his panicked eyes. I never saw a single penny of that $50,000. But you know who did see that money, DeAndre. You know who needed exactly $50,000 that specific month to cover his massive gambling debts and his elite fraternity dues. DeAndre was physically shaking now. He looked at Sloane, who was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. The perfectly crafted illusion of the brilliant, benevolent hedge fund manager was shattering into a million pieces right in front of her. You did not fund me, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute crushing certainty. You committed felony identity theft. You stole my social security number, which you memorized from our mother's files when we were kids. You forged my signature as the primary business owner, and you signed as the guarantor to push the loan through a predatory commercial lender who did not ask enough questions. You took out a massive loan in my name, effectively ruining my financial credit before I was even old enough to understand what a credit score was, just so you could fund your own pathetic, flashy lifestyle. The realization hit Sloane like a physical blow. She stumbled back a step, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. She looked at her husband as if she was seeing a complete stranger. You lied to me, she whispered, her voice trembling. You told me you were an early-stage investor. You told me you were her savior. I did what I had to do, DeAndre stammered, holding his hands up defensively. I was just a kid in college. I was under a lot of pressure. Dad told me I had to keep up appearances. You stole from a homeless child, Sloane hissed, stepping away from him in disgust. You threatened to go to the authorities today, I said, bringing the focus back to the immediate danger they were in. My voice remained completely level, contrasting sharply with the rising panic in the room. You threatened to have me arrested for corporate fraud. But you clearly did not look deep enough into your own husband's financial history before you marched into my building and tried to extort me. If we walk out of this room right now and hand these specific files over to the federal authorities, I will not be the one going to federal prison. You committed identity theft against a minor, DeAndre. You committed wire fraud across state lines. You funded your own parties with stolen money while your little sister was locked in a concrete cage. I watched the absolute terror wash over my family. The trap they had tried to set for me had just snapped shut around their own necks. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating as the reality of my words settled over them. DeAndre looked as though all the blood had been drained from his body. His expensive, tailored suit suddenly seemed too big for him as his shoulders slumped and his hands began to tremble visibly against the edge of the polished mahogany table. The arrogant smirk that had lived on his face since childhood melted away entirely, leaving behind the terrified expression of a cornered animal. He took a shaky step backward, his eyes darting frantically between me and Marcus, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. Sloane stood frozen, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the back of her leather chair so tightly, her knuckles turned pale white. The realization of what I had just revealed was hitting her in cold, suffocating waves. She turned her head slowly to look at the man she had married. The man she believed was a brilliant financial savior who had graciously funded his ungrateful little sister. The man who was actually nothing more than a common thief. The pristine illusion she had bought into was shattering right in front of her eyes. I watched her chest rise and fall with rapid, shallow breaths as her mind raced to process the legal and social implications of felony identity theft. Sloane came from a world where scandals were meant to be handled quietly, and financial crimes were only acceptable if they were committed in private boardrooms with offshore accounts. Petty identity theft against a homeless minor was dirty. It was beneath her class. The absolute disgust washing over her sharp features was palpable. She looked at DeAndre not as her equal partner, but as something repulsive she had accidentally stepped on. "You lied to me," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper that carried easily across the quiet room. "You looked me in the eye and told me you were an early-stage investor in Aegis Financial. You told me you funded her. You told me you were the sole reason she had a career." DeAndre raised his shaking hands with his palms facing outward in a desperate gesture of surrender. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, stammering sound came out. Sloane did not let him find his words. Her Upper East Side poise completely disintegrated as her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She closed the physical distance between them and shoved him hard against the chest. "You stupid, pathetic fraud!" She spat the words out like venom. "You led me to believe you were a financial genius. My father introduced you to our entire network of investors based on the lie that you had the vision to seed a multi-billion-dollar fintech firm. You used my family name and our elite connections to build your hedge fund, all while hiding the fact that you committed a federal crime to get your start. You are nothing but a common criminal." DeAndre tried to grab her hands to calm her down, but she recoiled violently, as if his touch would infect her with a disease. She turned her furious gaze toward my parents, who were standing frozen in shock near the heavy wooden doors. "And you too," she said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You covered for him. You stood in my Hamptons estate sipping my family wine and nodding along while he spun his pathetic lies. You are all exactly what my father warned me about. You are low-class grifters trying to play dress-up in a world you do not belong in." The racist undertones of her rant were not subtle. The mask of her progressive, wealthy liberalism had completely slipped, revealing the deeply ingrained prejudice she held toward my family. She felt superior, and now she felt utterly humiliated that she had tied her prestigious family name to a man who stole from a child. I stood silently behind my podium, watching the chaos unfold. I did not need to lift a single finger to destroy them, because they were eagerly tearing each other apart. Vivica had spent her entire adult life idolizing wealth and proximity to whiteness. She had contorted herself into whatever shape was necessary to fit into the high society circles that Sloane occupied. She had tolerated the passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults for years just to maintain the illusion that her family had finally arrived at the top. But Vivica had one absolute fatal weakness: her blind, obsessive devotion to her son. Hearing this wealthy white woman publicly humiliate her golden child and call her family low-class grifters flipped a dangerous switch inside my mother. The carefully curated persona of the sophisticated Wall Street mother evaporated instantly. Vivica lunged forward, inserting herself directly between Sloane and DeAndre. Her eyes were wide and wild with a maternal rage that I had never once seen directed at anyone who had hurt me. "Do not you dare talk to my son like that!" Vivica screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You think you are so much better than us. You think your old money family is so pure and untouchable." Vivica pushed her finger aggressively into the shoulder of her daughter-in-law, forcing the younger woman to stumble backward in her designer heels. Sloane gasped in shock at the physical contact, her eyes wide with outrage. "Do not touch me," Sloane commanded, but her voice lacked its previous authority and cracked under the pressure. "I will touch you and I will tell you exactly who you are," Vivica yelled, stepping closer and backing Sloane toward the conference table. "You stand there acting like you are royalty, but we all know the truth about your precious family trust. Your father has been hemorrhaging money for a decade. Your family name is the only thing you have left because your bank accounts are running on absolute fumes. You needed DeAndre just as much as he needed you. Do not stand here and pretend you are doing us a massive favor by letting my son marry you." The face of my sister-in-law turned a mottled shade of red and white. She looked around the room frantically as if hoping someone would step in and silence my mother. But Winston was too paralyzed by fear to move, and Marcus and I simply watched the spectacle in cold silence. "You broke, washed-up snob!" Vivica continued relentlessly, her voice growing louder and more frantic with every single word. "You would not have even let my son through the front door of your ridiculous country club if he had not shown up with heavy pockets. You looked down your nose at us from day one, but you had no problem spending the money my son brought into your marriage. You are a complete hypocrite and a parasite." Vivica was breathing heavily now, her chest heaving as she glared at the woman standing before her. "If it were not for Corinne, money your broke family would have laughed DeAndre out of New York," Vivica screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "My son brought millions to the table and saved your family from public embarrassment, so do not you dare stand there and act like he is beneath you." The boardroom went entirely still again. The echoes of my mother's screaming faded into the acoustic paneling, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt heavier and more dangerous than before. Sloane stared at Vivica in absolute shock, her mouth slightly open as she processed the confession. DeAndre buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, miserable groan that sounded like a dying animal. Winston suddenly looked as if he was going to vomit right on the carpet. He reached out and grabbed Vivica by the arm, pulling her back with a frantic, terrifying urgency. "Shut your mouth, Vivica!" Winston hissed, his voice thick with unadulterated panic. "Shut your mouth right now!" But the words had already been spoken. They were out in the open, hanging in the air between us all like thick black smoke. I froze. Every muscle in my body went completely rigid as my highly trained analytical mind seized upon the specific phrasing my mother had just used. I replayed the sentence in my head, breaking it apart and analyzing the variables. "If it were not for Corinne money, your broke family would have laughed DeAndre out of New York." My money. The phrase echoed loudly in my mind. I looked down at the commercial loan document still resting on the table in front of Marcus. The forged loan, the identity theft, the initial financial crime that DeAndre had committed when I was a homeless teenager. The principal amount on that physical document was exactly $50,000. In the grand scheme of Wall Street and the Hamptons, elite, $50,000 was absolutely nothing. It was barely enough to cover a month of basic operating expenses in the social circles Sloane inhabited. It certainly was not enough to impress an old money family trust. It was not enough to buy entry into exclusive country clubs or purchase a luxury Manhattan penthouse. $50,000 would not make a single dent in the kind of financial hemorrhage the trust of my sister-in-law was experiencing. Yet my mother had just explicitly stated that DeAndre brought millions to the table. She had explicitly stated that my money was the core reason he was accepted into their wealthy world. The mathematics of her statement simply did not align with the physical evidence on the table. I slowly lifted my gaze from the document and looked at my mother. Vivica was currently shrugging off the tight grip Winston had on her arm, her chest still heaving with misplaced indignation. She had not yet realized the massive magnitude of the mistake she had just made. "My money?" I asked, my voice unnervingly calm, cutting through the lingering thick tension in the room. Vivica stiffened, finally looking over at me. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting away, as the adrenaline of her argument with Sloane began to fade, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of what she had just accidentally admitted. "The forged loan on this table is for exactly $50,000, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step around the wooden podium. $50,000 is pocket change to people like the father of your precious daughter-in-law. It is not enough to buy into high society circles in New York. It is certainly not enough to save a failing family trust." I kept walking with measured steps until I was standing directly in front of my parents. Winston was sweating profusely now. He kept looking at the exit doors as if calculating whether he could physically run away. DeAndre had lowered his hands from his face and was staring at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "What money?" "Vivica," I asked, dropping my voice to a terrifying quiet whisper. "What money are you talking about?" Winston stepped quickly in front of my mother, holding his hands up defensively. His entire body was shaking. "She misspoke. Corinne," Winston stammered, his voice pitching up a nervous octave. "She is just upset. She is confused. She means the loan. She means the $50,000 from the original loan. She is just exaggerating because she is angry right now. Nobody is talking about millions. There is no other money. Please just let us leave. We will drop the equity claim entirely. We will walk away forever. Just let us leave your building." The sheer raw desperation in the voice of my father told me absolutely everything I needed to know. There was a much larger and darker secret hiding beneath the polished floorboards of their perfect New York lives. The $50,000 forgery was just the tip of the iceberg. There was a massive undiscovered reservoir of stolen wealth that they had built their fake empire upon, and it was somehow attached directly to my name. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I ignored Winston completely. I stepped closer, forcing my father to either stand his ground or step aside out of cowardice. He stepped aside. I looked down at the woman who had brought me into the world and then callously abandoned me to freeze in the dark. "Look at me," I commanded. Vivica kept her eyes glued to the expensive floor. Her shaking hands were wringing the fabric of her sequined dress. "You just told Sloane that my money saved her family," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly steady and relentless. "You said DeAndre brought millions to the table. You are greedy and you are undeniably cruel. But you are not bad at math, Mother. You know the exact difference between $50,000 and millions. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I heavily suggest you answer me very carefully, because my chief legal officer is standing right behind me, and there are high-definition security cameras recording every single word spoken in this room. What money did you use to buy your son his New York lifestyle?" Winston grabbed her shoulder, shaking her roughly. "Do not say another word." Vivica Winston pleaded, hot tears of panic actually welling in his eyes. "Please be quiet. We need to call a lawyer. Do not say anything else to her." But the immense pressure was simply too much for her to bear. The deep humiliation of being cornered, the very real threat of federal prison for DeAndre, the racist insults from Sloane, and now my relentless cold interrogation had pushed Vivica far past the breaking point of her fragile ego. She could not handle the feeling of being trapped like a rat. She could not handle the devastating feeling of losing all her power in front of an audience. She jerked her shoulder away from Winston with a sudden violent movement. She threw her hands up in the air, completely surrendering to the chaotic, ugly rage that was boiling deep inside her. She looked at me, her face twisted into a hideous mask of resentment and pure desperation. She was going to use the truth as a weapon, hoping it would somehow hurt me more than it incriminated her. "Shut up, Winston!" Vivica screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical fury. "She is going to find out anyway. Look at her. She has expensive lawyers and private investigators. She is going to dig until she finds it." Vivica turned her wild, furious eyes back to me. "You want to know what money, Corinne? You really want to know exactly how we afforded to give your brother the beautiful life he deserved?" The room was so incredibly quiet, I could hear the low hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Marcus stood completely still behind me. Sloane had stopped breathing entirely. DeAndre tightly closed his eyes as if he was bracing for a massive physical impact. The life insurance. Vivica shrieked, the veins in her neck bulging prominently against her skin. The life insurance policy we took out on you, the $500,000 we got when you died. The silence that followed that horrific confession was absolute. It was a suffocating vacuum that seemed to draw all the oxygen out of the massive boardroom. Winston had finally managed to clamp his large hand over the mouth of his wife, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the air, dripping with a sickening reality that I could barely comprehend. The $500,000 we got when you died. Vivica had screamed those words with such venomous pride, as if cashing in on my supposed death was her greatest financial achievement. I stood perfectly still behind the heavy wooden table, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But my face betrayed absolutely nothing. DeAndre was visibly trembling now, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he looked from his mother to me and then to Sloane, who looked as if she might actually vomit right there on the imported rug. Sloane had spent her entire life shielding herself from the ugly realities of the world, wrapping herself in old money prestige, and now she was standing elbow to elbow with a family of common criminals who had faked the death of a child for a payout. "Get them out," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. I did not yell. I did not need to. Marcus simply nodded and signaled to the security detail that had been waiting just outside the glass doors. The men in black suits moved swiftly, separating Winston and Vivica, and physically guiding them toward the exit. Vivica tried to struggle, her heels sliding against the polished marble, but the guards were relentless. DeAndre stumbled backward, his eyes locked on me, pleading silently. But I offered him no comfort. Sloane marched out ahead of them, her face pale and furious, clearly ready to distance herself from the radioactive disaster she had married into. The moment the heavy doors clicked shut, sealing them out of my sanctuary, I turned to Marcus. Find out exactly what she meant. I commanded, my voice hard and entirely focused. I want every single record, every police report, every insurance claim they ever filed. Tear their history apart and bring me the pieces. For the next 48 hours, the penthouse of Aegis Financial became a war room. I did not sleep. I barely drank enough water to keep myself upright. Instead, I paced the length of the glass windows, watching the lights of the city below. While my team of top-tier private investigators and forensic accountants went to work, Marcus brought in specialists who knew exactly how to navigate the murky waters of decades-old municipal records. We pulled threads that had been buried under years of careful deception, and what we found was a truth so deeply disturbing it made the original abandonment seem almost merciful. Marcus walked into my office on Wednesday evening, carrying a thick manila folder. His usual stoic expression had been replaced by a look of profound disgust. He set the file down on my desk and opened it without a word. I looked down at the documents, illuminated by the soft glow of my desk lamp. 3 years after they packed up that moving truck and drove away from Atlanta, leaving me in the dark with a single $50 bill, Winston and Vivica filed a missing persons report. They waited exactly 3 years to ensure there was no trace of me left in the local school system or child protective services. They went to a precinct in Georgia and put on a masterful performance. They cried to the police, claiming their beloved daughter had run away from home during a difficult transitional period. They claimed they had been searching for me relentlessly, but had found nothing. Then a few months later, a body was found in a river, just outside the county lines. A young, unidentified girl who matched my general description. The remains were badly decomposed, making visual identification incredibly difficult, but Winston and Vivica stepped right into the morgue and positively identified the body as mine. They buried an unknown child under my name. They stood over a grave and cried fake tears, and then they walked straight from the cemetery to the local branch of Pacific Life Insurance. They filed a massive claim on a policy they had taken out on me when I was just an infant. The payout was exactly $500,000. They declared me legally dead, erased my existence from the world, and took the cash. Marcus pointed to the financial tracing documents showing exactly where that blood money had gone. They did not use it to pay off debts or build a modest life. They used the $500,000 to buy DeAndre his way into the New York elite. They paid for the most expensive private basketball academies. They bought him tailored suits and a luxury car. They funded the lifestyle that allowed him to rub elbows with people like Sloane and her father. They built their entire glittering, perfect New York facade directly on top of my literal grave. They used my death to fund his life. As the sheer magnitude of their depravity washed over me, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a restricted number, but I knew exactly who it was. Word had clearly gotten back to DeAndre that my investigators were poking around in his past. The private wealth managers and hedge fund contacts he relied on were starting to get questions from my forensic accountants. The walls of his fragile empire were rapidly closing in on him. I did not answer the phone. I simply let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again. Then again. The calls came in a relentless, frantic wave, an endless stream of desperation breaking against the silent walls of my office. This was the beginning of the 119 missed calls. I sat at my desk, pulling up the voicemail transcriptions on my computer screen, and watched the psychological unraveling of the golden child in real time. DeAndre oscillated wildly between entirely different personas, trying to find the one that would manipulate me into stopping the investigation. The early voicemails were pathetic and weeping. "Corinne, please," he sobbed into the receiver, his voice thick and wet. "I am begging you. You have to stop these investigators. My investors are getting spooked. The banks are freezing. My transition accounts, please, Corinne. You are my sister. I know we messed up. I know Mom and Dad did a terrible thing, but I was just a kid. I did not know where the money came from. Please forgive us. Do not destroy my life." When I did not respond to his begging, the tone of the calls shifted dramatically. The sadness evaporated, and the pure, arrogant entitlement rushed in to take its place. "You owe us," he shouted in voicemail number 45. "You would be nothing without the struggle we put you through. You think you are so smart up in your tower, but you are just trying to ruin my life because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me. Answer the phone, you coward." I sat there listening to the audio files one after another, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. My brother was a fragile narcissist who had never faced a single consequence in his entire 35 years on Earth. And now that the bill was finally coming due, he was fracturing under the pressure. By voicemail, number 80, the threats began. The sheer panic in his voice had mutated into violent hostility. "I am going to the press, Corinne," he hissed into the phone, the background noise suggesting he was pacing wildly on a city street. "I am going to tell the media that you are a complete sociopath. I will tell them you faked your own death just to avoid paying your family back. I will say you disappeared on purpose and let us grieve while you hoarded millions. I will destroy your reputation. Aegis Financial will be investigated by the SEC. When I am done with you, I will burn your entire life to the ground if you do not call off these dogs." I simply archived the audio files, sending each one directly to Marcus, to be added to the growing mountain of evidence against them. The final voicemails leading up to number 119 were nothing but pure incoherent despair. He was leaving messages in the middle of the night, his words slurred, probably intoxicated, begging me to just pick up the phone, telling me that Sloane was packing her bags, telling me his hedge fund was completely illiquid, he was drowning, and the only person holding a life preserver was the sister he had declared dead 20 years ago. Marcus watched me from across the desk as the final voicemail finished playing, the silence returning to the room. "What is the play here?" Marcus asked softly, leaning back in his leather chair. "We have enough evidence of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and insurance fraud to have the FBI raid their homes by midnight. We can hand them over right now." I slowly closed my laptop and looked out at the glittering skyline of Manhattan, the city that my family thought they had conquered using my stolen life. I thought about calling the authorities and letting the justice system handle it. But that felt entirely too clinical. It felt too distant. They had ambushed me in my own building. They had demanded my equity and insulted my struggle. They had buried a nameless child and danced on the grave with pockets full of cash. Just sending them to prison was not enough. They needed to feel the exact same total devastating loss of control that I felt when I was 12 years old, sitting in that dark apartment with no power and no food. I do not want to arrest them yet, I said, my voice dangerously calm. I want to watch them walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. I want them to think they have won right up until the moment I take absolutely everything from them. I opened a drawer in my desk and pulled out a stack of heavy cream-colored stationery. It was the official letterhead of the Aegis Financial Executive Office, the kind of paper that felt expensive just to touch. I uncapped my fountain pen and began to write, my handwriting flowing in sharp, deliberate strokes. "We are not going to call the police," I explained to Marcus, without looking up from the paper. "We are going to invite them back here. They are desperate, and desperate people will cling to any illusion of hope. We just have to offer them the right bait." I drafted a formal gold-embossed invitation. It was not addressed to my mother or my father. They were merely parasites. The real power in their twisted dynamic was the old money connection they had latched onto. I addressed the envelope to Richard Sloane's arrogant father, the head of the White Family Trust, and I addressed it to DeAndre. The message I wrote was brief, professional, and entirely deceptive. I stated that after careful consideration of our previous meeting, I was ready to put personal differences aside for the sake of financial pragmatism. I wrote that I recognized the mutual benefit of a partnership and that I was prepared to negotiate a $50 million buyout to save their failing hedge fund and stabilize their family trust. I concluded the letter by telling them to meet me at the Aegis Tower penthouse boardroom on Friday morning to sign the final contracts. I slid the heavy paper into the envelope and sealed it, passing it across the desk to Marcus. "Send this by private courier. First thing in the morning," I instructed. "Make sure it is handed directly to Richard." Marcus looked at the envelope, and a slow, understanding smile spread across his face. "They are going to think you caved," he said, shaking his head. "They're going to think their threats actually worked. They will walk in here on Friday, expecting a $50 million check. They will walk in here expecting to own me," I corrected quietly, folding my hands together on the desk. "They think, because I am the daughter they abandoned, that I will eventually seek their approval. They think they can bully me into saving them, but they do not understand how money actually moves in this city. They only know how to steal it and spend it. I know how to weaponize it." I looked back out at the city lights, feeling a profound sense of anticipation. The trap was set. The bait was deployed. All I had to do now was wait for Friday morning, when my family would put on their best designer suits and walk right into the financial massacre I had prepared for them. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear sky that made Manhattan look like it was carved out of solid crystal. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse boardroom, watching the miniature yellow taxis navigate the concrete canyons far below. My posture was perfectly straight, my breathing slow and measured. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than the entire apartment my parents had abandoned me in. Marcus stood near the heavy mahogany doors, holding a pristine leather folder containing the final nails for the coffins of my family. At precisely 10 o'clock, the private elevator chimed. The heavy doors swung open and the parade of delusion began. They walked into my boardroom as if they had already purchased the entire building. Winston and Vivica led the way, trying their absolute hardest to project an aura of effortless wealth. Vivica was wearing a deeply ostentatious designer dress that screamed new money and desperation, her wrists heavy with gold bracelets that clanked loudly in the quiet room. Winston wore a suit that was just slightly too tight around the shoulders, puffing out his chest and attempting to look like a titan of industry. But they were completely eclipsed by the sheer unearned arrogance of the people walking behind them. DeAndre strutted into the room with his shoulders pulled back, his bespoke jacket perfectly pressed. The terrified coward who had left me dozens of weeping voicemails was completely gone, replaced once again by the smug golden boy who believed he was untouchable. Sloane walked beside him, her chin tilted up, her eyes scanning my boardroom with a look of mild boredom, as if she was inspecting a property she intended to gut and renovate. But the true focal point of their pathetic little group was Richard. Sloane's father was a man who had spent his entire existence failing upward on the cushion of generational wealth. He was tall, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a deeply tanned face that spoke of endless afternoons on private golf courses. He wore a navy pinstripe suit that projected absolute authority. He did not look around the room with curiosity or awe. He simply looked at the grand mahogany table and chose the seat directly opposite mine, claiming the position of power, with the casual entitlement of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Winston and Vivica scrambled to take the seats to his left, while DeAndre and Sloane sat to his right, forming a unified wall of delusion across my conference table. I remained standing by the window, letting the silence stretch out and wrap around them. I watched the slight shifts in their body language. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and offered me a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the kind of smile a predator gives right before it snaps its jaws closed. "Well," Corinne, Richard began, his voice carrying that specific booming resonance of a man accustomed to dominating boardrooms. "I must say you have put together quite an impressive little operation here. I was reading up on your background this morning. It is a remarkable story, really. A girl from the streets pulling herself up by her bootstraps to build a financial firm. You are incredibly articulate for someone with your background, and you have been very, very lucky in this current market cycle." The blatant racism and staggering condescension in his tone were so incredibly palpable that they practically hung in the air like a foul odor. He called me articulate, as if my ability to string a sentence together was a miraculous anomaly. He called a multi-billion-dollar fintech empire that I had built with my own blood and sweat a product of luck. He was attempting to diminish me, to reduce me to a charity case who had stumbled into a fortune that she did not know how to manage. Vivica nodded eagerly along with his words, leaning forward and giving Richard a sickeningly sweet smile of agreement. Winston crossed his arms and looked at me as if he had personally orchestrated my entire career trajectory. "My son-in-law has told me all about the unfortunate misunderstandings that occurred earlier this week." Richard continued, waving a dismissive hand, as if the felony identity theft and the fake death certificate were nothing more than minor administrative errors. Family disputes can be so incredibly messy, especially when new money is involved. People get emotional, things are said. But DeAndre showed me the letter you sent. You have finally realized that you are out of your depth in these waters. You recognize that playing in the big leagues requires pedigree and institutional backing. You realize that your little startup needs the kind of legitimacy that only an established family name can provide. Richard unbuttoned his suit jacket and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a dark blue folder. He tossed the folder onto the center of the mahogany table and slid it slowly across the polished wood until it stopped just inches from my hands. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute predatory confidence. "We are prepared to accept your $50 million capital injection into DeAndre's hedge fund." Richard dictated his tone, leaving zero room for negotiation. "It is a smart move on your part, Corinne. Buying into our family trust gives you the shield of respectability that you desperately need in this city. But $50 million alone does not buy you a seat at our table. You lack the institutional knowledge to protect that kind of capital. You lack the refinement and the long-term vision required to navigate the upper echelons of global finance. So we have amended the terms of your generous offer." I looked down at the thick document, but I did not reach for it. DeAndre was practically vibrating with excitement, his eyes shining with greedy anticipation. Sloane was tracing the rim of a crystal water glass with her finger, looking at me with pure, unadulterated triumph. She actually believed that her father had come here and put the arrogant street rat back in her place. In exchange for the $50 million, Richard continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You will also be signing over 20% of the voting shares in Aegis Financial directly to our family trust. Furthermore, I will be taking an immediate seat on your executive board as a senior managing director. I will have full veto power over your portfolio acquisitions and your corporate strategy moving forward. He demanded access to my proprietary trading algorithms. He wanted the legal authority to fire my senior staff. He was attempting a hostile takeover of a multi-billion-dollar firm using nothing but the sheer audacity of his whiteness and a $50 million extortion attempt. He genuinely believed that I would hand over the keys to my kingdom just for the privilege of being associated with his crumbling legacy. We are doing you a massive favor here, Corinne Richards said, leaning back into his chair with a sickeningly satisfied sigh. We are going to take the wheel before you crash this company into the ground. We know how to manage this kind of wealth better than you do, sweetheart. The word sweetheart hung in the air, dripping with so much toxic paternalism that it made the silence following it feel almost violent. Winston and Vivica were beaming. They looked at Richard with absolute adoration, completely oblivious to the fact that Richard had just insulted them, and their entire lineage by implying that our bloodline was incapable of managing wealth. They were so blinded by their proximity to Richard's perceived power that they were willing to sit there and watch a mediocre white man try to steal the empire their daughter had built. DeAndre gave me a pointed look, arching his eyebrow as if commanding me to pick up the pen and submit to my betters. I stared at the thick legal document resting on the table. I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle in my face. The silence stretched on for 10 seconds, then 20. The smug smiles on their faces began to falter just slightly as the quiet became unnerving. Richard frowned, his thick silver eyebrows drawing together in irritation. He was not used to women remaining silent when he gave an order. He expected tears or gratitude or immediate compliance. He did not expect absolute icy stillness. I slowly reached my hand under the edge of the conference table. My fingers found the small metal control panel hidden beneath the wood. I pressed a single rectangular button. Instantly, the atmosphere in the boardroom completely transformed. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. The massive floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows that surrounded the entire penthouse suddenly and simultaneously tinted pitch black, blocking out the morning sun and plunging the room into artificial darkness. Vivica let out a short, startled gasp, grabbing Winston by the arm. Sloane stopped tracing the rim of her water glass, her head snapping around to look at the darkened windows. Richard sat up straight, his predatory posture dissolving into sudden alert confusion. Before any of them could speak, a secondary mechanical whirring sound filled the room. From the ceiling directly behind my podium, a massive state-of-the-art projection screen smoothly descended. The overhead LED lights dimmed to a cool, dramatic blue. The high-definition projector mounted above the conference table flared to life, casting a brilliant white light across the faces of my family. The screen illuminated with a painfully detailed and intricate digital map. It was a sprawling, complex web of financial data, corporate structures, hidden liabilities, leveraged assets, shell companies, and margin calls. The map on the screen was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. My investigators had spent the last 48 hours tearing through the firewalls of their offshore accounts. At the very top of the massive diagram, written in bold crimson letters, was the name of Richard's Sacred Family Trust. Directly beneath it, connected by dozens of red lines representing massive outstanding debts, was DeAndre's failing hedge fund. The data displayed on the screen was not a portfolio of immense generational wealth. It was a real-time autopsy of a financial corpse. The screen detailed exactly how Richard had been quietly liquidating the remaining assets of his family trust for the past 10 years, just to cover the interest payments on catastrophic bad loans. It showed how he had funneled the last of his usable capital into DeAndre's hedge fund in a desperate blind gamble to recoup his losses. It showed the catastrophic margin calls that had hit DeAndre earlier in the week. The screen showed that their entire net worth was not just zero, it was hundreds of millions of dollars in the negative. The $50 million they were demanding was not an investment. It was a frantic attempt to stop the bank from seizing every single property asset and bank account attached to both of their names. They were not titans of industry. They were drowning men wearing expensive suits. Richard stared at the massive glowing screen, and his deeply tanned face went the color of wet ash. The breath left his lungs in a ragged, hollow wheeze. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. Sloane stood up from her chair, her hands trembling violently as she read the catastrophic negative numbers attached to the trust funds she had relied on her entire life. DeAndre looked as if he was going to pass out, his eyes darting frantically across the screen, reading the exact details of the corporate fraud he had been committing to hide the losses from his father-in-law. Winston and Vivica simply stared at the board in total incomprehension, unable to read the complex financial markers, but understanding enough from the sheer terror radiating from Richard and Sloane to know that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong. The contrast between the absolute panic of my family and the cold mechanical hum of the projector created a symphony of destruction. I had waited 20 years for this exact moment. I had built an empire block by block, dollar by dollar, specifically, so I would never be at the mercy of people like them again. They thought they were walking into a negotiation. They thought they still held the power of my past over my head. But the ghost they had buried in Georgia was not here to negotiate. The ghost was here to collect. I stepped away from the window and walked slowly to the head of the table. The cool blue light from the projector illuminated my face as I looked down at the men and women who had come into my home to steal from me. I did not pick up the predatory contract Richard had slid across the table. I simply pushed it off the edge of the mahogany wood, letting the thick stack of papers scatter haphazardly onto the floor at his feet. I looked directly into the panicked, wide eyes of the man who had just called me a lucky street rat. My voice was smooth, even, and utterly devoid of mercy as it resonated through the darkened boardroom. "I did not invite you here to invest in your fund." "Richard," I stated softly, letting the absolute finality of the words sink deep into his bones. "I invited you here to inform you that I own it." The absolute silence that swallowed the boardroom was so profound that I could hear the ragged, uneven breathing of my father from all the way across the long mahogany table. Richard sat frozen in his luxurious leather chair, his mouth slightly open, his perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. The words I had just spoken hung in the cold air conditioning of the penthouse, pressing down on their chests like physical weights. "I invited you here to inform you that I own it." The concept was so entirely foreign to Richard that his brain simply refused to process the information. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the reality of his situation. "That is impossible," Richard finally stammered, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a thin, reedy whisper. "You cannot own my trust. It is a closed generational fund. We have private banking relationships that span decades. You are lying. This is a bluff." I did not smile. I simply gestured to the massive glowing projector screen behind me where the undeniable proof of his financial ruin was mapped out in bright digital colors. "I do not bluff, Richard," I said, my voice echoing softly against the glass walls. "While you and my pathetic brother were busy planning how to march into my office and extort me for $50 million, my acquisitions team was already dismantling your lives. You see, when DeAndre came into my building and threatened to expose my company using my own stolen identity, he made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed I was playing defense. He assumed I would panic and write a check to make the scandal go away. But I do not play defense." I began to walk slowly down the length of the conference table, the blue light from the projector casting long shadows across the terrified faces of my family. Over the past 48 hours, I explained, my tone methodical and entirely detached. Aegis Financial engaged in a highly coordinated debt acquisition sweep. We did not use our primary corporate accounts. We used a network of 7 anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. We approached every single private equity firm, every commercial lender, and every offshore bank that currently holds the toxic debt of your family trust and the junk bonds of my brother's failing hedge fund. DeAndre let out a whimper, pulling at the collar of his bespoke suit as if he was suddenly suffocating. Vivica was clutching her chest, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "You were drowning in bad paper, Richard," I continued, stopping right behind his chair. "Your creditors were already preparing to carve up your remaining assets. They knew your family name was nothing but a hollow shell holding up a mountain of defaulted loans. So when my shell company swooped in and offered to buy up your debt at 60 cents on the dollar, they were absolutely thrilled to offload the risk. They took the cash and they sold us everything, every single promissory note, every leveraged asset, every margin call. We bought it all. I bought it all." Sloane leaped to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the marble floor. Her face was contorted with panic and a desperate, furious denial. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "That is illegal. You are breaking the law. You are committing financial fraud just like you always do. I am calling the Securities and Exchange Commission right now." I turned to look at her, letting my cold gaze sweep over her trembling frame. "It is not illegal, Sloane," I corrected her with brutal Wall Street logic. "It is called a hostile takeover via debt acquisition. It is a perfectly legal, highly aggressive strategy used by the very elite financial institutions your father pretends to still be a part of. The fact that you do not understand the mechanics of how this works just proves my point. You do not know how to generate wealth. You only know how to spend the money that other people bleed for." I walked back toward my podium, pulling up the next slide on the projector. The screen shifted from the web of shell companies to a stark, simple ledger detailing the exact nature of their relationships. I looked at Sloane and then down at my trembling brother. "Your entire marriage is a masterclass in parasitic fraud," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Your family has been broke for a decade, Sloane. Your father squandered the last of your generational wealth years ago. You married DeAndre because he walked into your exclusive country club throwing around cash he stole from a dead child. You thought you were marrying new money to save your old money status." I paused, letting the humiliation wash over her before turning my attention to my brother. "And you, DeAndre," I said, watching him flinch at the sound of his name. "You married her because you wanted the pedigree you could never buy. You wanted the pale skin and the Hamptons address to validate the empire you built on top of my grave. You are a fake billionaire marrying a fake aristocrat. You are both entirely leveraged to the absolute limit. You have nothing but debt and a desperate need to pretend you are better than everyone else." Winston tried to speak, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Corinne, please," he begged, reaching a hand out across the table. "We are your parents. We can fix this. We can work together." I ignored him completely, bringing up the final document on the screen. It was a detailed list of every single physical and liquid asset they possessed. "Let us talk about the collateral." "Securing these massive loans," I said, tapping the wooden podium. "When you take out high-risk loans to fund a failing hedge fund and a bankrupt family trust, the lenders require collateral. And because you were also incredibly confident in your own delusions of grandeur, you signed over absolutely everything." The room was so quiet that the sound of Vivica quietly crying was the only thing competing with the hum of the projector. "Sloane," I said, reading from the screen behind me, "your beautiful family estate in the Hamptons, the one that has been in your family for 4 generations, is listed as the primary asset backing the third restructuring loan your father took out 2 years ago. DeAndre, your Manhattan penthouse, your fleet of luxury cars, and your offshore accounts are tied up in the margin calls that Aegis Financial now exclusively holds." I turned my eyes slowly to Winston and Vivica. They were clinging to each other, looking like terrified children. "And Winston," I said, watching his face crumble in real time. Your entire retirement portfolio and that beautiful house you bought when you abandoned me to move to New York are the secondary collateral for the hedge fund. You bet everything on your golden boy. You risked your entire future because you truly believed he was a prodigy and I was just excess baggage. The sheer gravity of what I was saying was finally sinking in. They were not just losing a business deal. They were losing their homes, their status, their entire identities. They were about to be erased from the world they had sacrificed their souls to inhabit. As the sole primary creditor of these debts, I have the legal right to call them in at my discretion. I explained, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. And because your funds are currently in massive breach of your financial covenants, I am calling in the debts today. Right now. The eviction notices, the asset seizure warrants, and the account freezes are already being filed by my legal team across 3 different jurisdictions. I looked at the 5 of them taking in their ruined, expensive clothes and their shattered, arrogant faces. You have absolutely nothing left, I said, the finality of the statement hanging heavy in the air. You are all officially bankrupt. The breakdown was instantaneous and catastrophic. Winston let out a loud, guttural sob, burying his face in his large hands as the realization that he was entirely destitute finally broke him. Vivica wailed, grasping at her designer jewelry as if she could somehow protect it from being repossessed. Richard simply stared blankly at the mahogany table, his mind completely snapping under the weight of his total public failure. But it was Sloane who reacted with the most violent intensity. The realization that she was completely stripped of her white privilege, her wealth and her elite status, triggered something feral and deeply ugly inside her. The polished mask of the progressive high society wife completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but pure, concentrated hatred. She turned slowly toward DeAndre, who was sitting paralyzed in his chair, tears streaming down his face. Sloane was trembling so violently that her teeth were actually chattering. She looked at the man she had married, the man who was supposed to be her financial savior, and her face twisted into a mask of absolute disgust. She raised her hand and struck him across the face. The slap echoed through the quiet boardroom with the sharp cracking sound of a gunshot. DeAndre recoiled, crying out in pain and shock as he grabbed his cheek. His chair tipped dangerously backward, but Sloane did not stop. She grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined custom suit, yanking him forward so she could scream directly into his face. "You worthless street rat!" Sloane shrieked, her voice completely feral and completely unhinged. "You dragged me down into the gutter with you. You disgusting, pathetic fraud. You are nothing but a thief who played dress-up in my world. You ruined my family. You ruined my life." She began to hit him again, slapping his shoulders and his chest, her perfectly manicured nails catching the fabric of his shirt. The racist slurs she had clearly been holding back for years came pouring out of her mouth, a vile stream of hatred that completely shattered the pristine image of their perfect modern marriage. She called him a ghetto thug. She called him a parasite. She screamed that he was biologically incapable of success without stealing from his betters. DeAndre tried to push her away, but he was too broken, too completely defeated to mount a real defense. Vivica, seeing her precious golden boy being physically and verbally assaulted by the white woman she had practically worshipped, let out a screech of pure maternal fury. Vivica lunged out of her chair, launching herself across the room and grabbing Sloane by the hair. "Do not! You put your hands on my son!" Vivica roared, yanking Sloane backward. The 2 women tumbled to the floor in a mess of designer dresses and violently flailing limbs. Winston yelled out, trying to intervene to pull his wife off the screaming heiress, but Richard suddenly snapped out of his catatonic state and grabbed Winston by the collar, throwing a clumsy, desperate punch at my father. The boardroom devolved into absolute physical chaos. The people who had walked into my building looking like royalty were now rolling around on the floor, pulling hair, screaming racist insults, and throwing punches like animals fighting over scraps in an alleyway. They were destroying each other, tearing apart the very fabric of their fake alliances and exposing the rotten core of their existence. Marcus took a step forward, ready to signal the security team to break up the violent brawl. but I held up my hand, stopping him in his tracks. I stood behind the podium, watching my family tear themselves to pieces under the cool blue light of the financial ruin I had orchestrated. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I simply watched them burn, knowing that the 12-year-old girl they had left to freeze in Atlanta was finally resting in peace. The physical altercation on the floor of my boardroom was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Vivica had her hands firmly twisted into the roots of Sloane's perfectly styled blonde hair, pulling with a vicious strength that belied her age. Sloane was shrieking a high-pitched sound that shattered the acoustic elegance of the penthouse. The wealthy heiress flailed wildly, her designer heels kicking against the polished wood of the conference table as she tried to scratch at the face of my mother. The sickening sound of tearing silk filled the air as the seam of Sloane's couture dress ripped open along the shoulder. Tiny white pearls from a broken necklace scattered across the floor, bouncing and rolling into the shadows like tiny teeth knocked loose in a street fight. Winston was red in the face, panting heavily as he threw his heavy frame into the chaos. He grabbed Vivica by the waist, trying to haul her off the screaming younger woman, but his leather shoes slipped on the scattered pearls. He crashed down onto his knees with a heavy thud, knocking the breath out of his lungs. Richard, the so-called titan of industry, was backed against the glass wall, clutching his bleeding lip and staring at the violent mess with a look of absolute catatonic shock. The entire facade of their sophisticated elite existence had evaporated in less than 3 minutes, leaving behind nothing but base animalistic panic. I stood perfectly still behind the podium, watching the financial and social slaughter I had orchestrated. Marcus remained silent beside me, a guardian witnessing the destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. Through the tangled limbs and the shouting, I saw movement near the base of the conference table. DeAndre had slipped out of his leather chair. His legs had simply given out beneath him. The golden boy of the family, the brilliant hedge fund manager, the man who had confidently swaggered into my building demanding $50 million. And my company was completely broken. The reality of his total ruination had finally severed his last thread of sanity. He knew the banks were going to seize his penthouse. He knew the federal authorities were going to freeze his offshore accounts. He knew he was looking at years in federal prison for the identity theft and wire fraud he had committed using my name. He did not try to stop his mother from attacking his wife. He did not try to help his father up from the floor. Instead, he turned his tear-streaked face toward me. The absolute terror in his eyes was almost intoxicating to witness. He dragged himself across the expensive rug on his hands and knees. His bespoke suit jacket hung loosely off his shoulders. His silk tie dragged against the floor, picking up dust. He was a pathetic, crawling shell of a man. He reached the base of my podium and collapsed completely. He threw his arms out and wrapped his shaking hands around the fabric of my tailored skirt, pulling at the hem like a frightened toddler begging for protection. "Corinne, please," he sobbed, his voice thick and wet with mucus and tears. The sound was pathetic, a high, keening wail that cut through the sounds of the women fighting behind him. "Please, Corinne, you have to stop this. You have to call off the banks. I am begging you. I am your brother. We share the same blood. You cannot do this to me. You cannot put me on the street. I have a child on the way. Sloane is pregnant, Corinne. You cannot make my baby homeless. Please, I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you want. Just please give me the money and let me keep my life." I looked down at the top of his head, watching his shoulders heave with uncontrollable sobs. He was invoking blood. He was invoking family. He was trying to use the concept of an unborn child to manipulate the sister he had legally declared dead so he could buy himself a sports car and a country club membership. The sheer audacity of his begging was staggering. He truly believed that because we shared genetic material, I owed him my mercy. He believed that his tears could wash away 20 years of betrayal and suffering. I reached down and grabbed the collar of his expensive, ruined suit. I did not pull him up. I simply forced his head back so he had to look directly into my eyes. The coldness in my gaze made him flinch, but I did not let him look away. "Blood!" I asked, my voice a quiet, deadly whisper that somehow carried immense weight over the noise in the room. "You want to talk to me about shared blood, DeAndre? Where was that blood when you were eating dry-aged steak in Manhattan? Where was that blood when you were popping bottles of champagne in exclusive nightclubs bought and paid for with the insurance money from my fake death?" He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head weakly as more tears spilled down his cheeks. "No, please," he whimpered. "Look at me," I commanded, my grip tightening on his collar. "Where was our shared blood when I was 12 years old scavenging out of dumpsters behind grocery stores in Atlanta? Where was your brotherly love when I was sleeping on freezing concrete wrapped in dirty newspapers, praying that nobody would attack me in the dark? You knew I was alive. You knew exactly what you and your parents did to me. You left me to starve and be swallowed by the streets. And when you needed more cash to fund your frat parties and your pathetic gambling debts, you did not hesitate to steal my identity. Where was your family loyalty when you forged my name to steal $50,000 and ruin the credit of a homeless child?" I let go of his collar in disgust, wiping my hand on my suit jacket, as if his touch had contaminated me. "You do not care about blood, DeAndre," I told him, stepping back. "You only care about the bank account attached to my name. You made your choices. You stole your fake life. And now you get to experience exactly what it feels like to have everything ripped away from you, while the people who are supposed to protect you just stand by and watch. I hope you enjoy the streets of New York as much as I enjoyed the streets of Atlanta." DeAndre collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, curling into a fetal position against the leg of the podium. He was entirely defeated. The sound of his devastating breakdown finally pierced through the red haze of anger that had consumed Winston. My father managed to shove himself to his feet, leaving Vivica and Sloane tangled together on the floor, panting and glaring at each other with pure venom. Winston was a disaster. His tie was ripped half off his neck. He was sweating profusely, and a long, angry scratch ran down his cheek where Sloane had caught him with her nails. His breathing was ragged and shallow as he stumbled toward me, stepping over the weeping form of his golden child. Winston held up his hands, palms facing me, in a gesture of desperate surrender. The arrogant, blustering patriarch who had marched into my office demanding a $10 million check was completely gone. In his place was a terrified old man watching the consequences of his horrific choices finally catch up to him. "Corinne, please stop this," Winston begged, his voice cracking. He looked around the room at the shattered glass, the scattered pearls, the ruined clothes, and the broken people. "This has gone too far. We submit. You win. You proved your point. We are sorry. We made a mistake 20 years ago. We were scared, and we were poor, and we made a terrible mistake. But you have to stop this financial attack. You are destroying everything." I simply stared at him, letting the silence stretch out and force him to sit in his own panic. "You cannot just wipe us out," Winston continued, his voice taking on a frantic, pleading tone. "Despite everything that happened, we are still your family. We gave you life. We are your legal parents, Corinne. You cannot deny that fact. You cannot legally or morally destroy the people who brought you into this world. You have a moral and legal obligation to your family. A judge would never allow this. Society would never allow a daughter to financially execute her own legal parents. You owe us a basic duty of care." He was grasping at straws. He was throwing out words like morality and legality, hoping that some invisible societal rule would suddenly descend from the ceiling and save him from the ruin he had so carefully built for himself. He actually thought he could use the legal definition of parenthood as a shield against the absolute devastation I was bringing down on his head. I looked at the bleeding, sweating man who had driven away from a foreclosed apartment, leaving his youngest child alone with a $50 bill and a sticky note. I looked at the man who had gone to a police station and filed a fake missing persons report so he could wait 3 years and cash out a life insurance policy on my ghost. I looked at him, attempting to invoke the sacred duty of a legal parent. A slow smile began to form on my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that makes the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees. It was a terrifying cold curving of my lips that made Winston stop talking immediately and take a nervous step backward. Marcus shifted slightly behind me, anticipating the final blow. Legal parents, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue. The smile remained fixed on my face as I tilted my head and stared directly into my father's terrified eyes. That is funny, Winston. That is incredibly funny that you would bring up the legal definitions of our relationship. I rested my hands on the edges of the podium, leaning forward just slightly. Let us talk about the law, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper that silenced the entire room. I reached into the wooden drawer of the podium and pulled out a single sheet of paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. I pressed a button on the console, and the complex digital map of their financial ruin on the massive projector screen instantly vanished. It was replaced by a high-definition scan of the document I was holding in my hand. The bright white light illuminated the horrified faces of my family in stark detail. Winston squinted at the screen, and then all the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Vivica let out a short, terrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as her eyes widened in absolute panic. DeAndre stopped his pathetic sobbing and stared up at the screen in utter confusion. Legally, I have no parents, I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls with absolute devastating finality. Legally, Corinne did not survive the winter exactly 20 years ago. You made sure of that. I pointed to the document looming on the screen. It was a state-certified death certificate. It bore my full given name, my date of birth, and the official seal of the medical examiner. You went to a police station in Georgia. I continued, stepping out from behind the podium so they could see the sheer, unadulterated disgust on my face. You filed a missing persons report 3 years after you abandoned me. You cried fake tears for the police. And then, when a badly decomposed body of a young girl was found in a river just outside the county lines, you walked right into the morgue and positively identified her as your runaway daughter. You declared me legally dead. You wiped my existence off the face of the earth. Sloane let out a horrified whimpering sound, shrinking back against the wall as the sheer depravity of what she was hearing finally registered in her mind. She was looking at my parents not just as low-class grifters, but as absolute monsters. She realized she had married into a family of ghouls. You took this death certificate, I said, tapping the physical copy in my hand, and you walked straight into the local branch of Pacific Life Insurance. You cashed out a $500,000 policy that you had taken out on me when I was a baby. You built your entire perfect New York lives on my literal grave. You used the blood money from my supposed death to buy your golden child his entry into high society. Winston was shaking so violently that his knees finally buckled. He dropped to the floor beside DeAndre, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He realized that the federal authorities would view this not just as a financial crime, but as a horrific act of fraud involving a minor. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the primal fear of a man who knows his life is over. I looked down at the architects of my childhood trauma. I had meticulously laid out every single piece of evidence. The trap was flawlessly executed, and there was absolutely no way out. I reached up and gently tapped the wireless earpiece hidden in my right ear, giving the final signal to my security team waiting in the corridor. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that sounded exactly like a vault sealing shut. The violent chaos that had consumed my family instantly froze. Winston choked on his own breath, his eyes darting frantically toward the entrance. Vivica and Sloane stopped their vicious grappling on the floor, their tangled hands freezing in place as the reality of the intrusion washed over them. 3 FBI agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers over their suits and 2 federal investigators carrying thick, secure briefcases stepped into the room. Their expressions were entirely blank, professional, and unyielding. They moved with the synchronized precision of predators who had finally cornered their prey. Marcus simply nodded to the lead agent, stepping aside and gesturing toward the conference table to let the federal authorities enter my sanctuary. The sheer magnitude of what was happening finally penetrated Richard's catatonic state. The arrogant old money patriarch, who had spent his entire life believing his generational wealth made him completely immune to consequences, tried to stand up. He placed his perfectly manicured hands on the mahogany table to push himself upward, but his knees buckled slightly underneath him. The lead investigator did not even blink as he walked directly over to Richard, bypassing the whimpering form of DeAndre on the floor. The investigator pulled a heavy sealed document from his briefcase and slapped it onto the table right over the scattered pearls from Sloane's broken necklace. The federal agent looked down at Richard with utter professional disdain. "Richard Sloane, you are being served with a federal subpoena for your direct involvement in laundering fraudulent insurance money through your family trust." The investigator announced, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the heavy air of the penthouse. "We have a complete, undeniable paper trail proving you knowingly accepted stolen federal funds and used them to artificially inflate DeAndre's hedge fund across international borders. Your assets are frozen as of 5 minutes ago, and your entire family trust is officially under federal receivership." Richard stared at the thick legal document as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His pristine navy pinstripe suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. All the blustering confidence, the toxic paternalism, the casual, unearned racism he had weaponized against me just an hour ago had completely evaporated. He was nothing but a terrified, hollow old man facing the absolute destruction of his legacy and the reality of spending his remaining years in a federal cell. Sloane let out a horrified gasp, pulling herself up from the floor and staring at her father in total disbelief. The untouchable wall of white privilege they had hid behind for generations had just been obliterated by the very financial systems they thought they controlled. Across the room, Winston and Vivica began to back away, their expensive shoes sliding erratically against the polished marble floor. The two FBI agents moved with terrifying efficiency, circling the massive conference table to block their path to the private elevator. Winston raised his shaking hands, stepping in front of his wife in a pathetic final attempt to play the grand protector. Sweat was pouring down his face, soaking the collar of his shirt and making his skin shine under the cool blue light of the projector screen. "You cannot do this," Winston stammered, his voice pitching upward in pure animal panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the agents and then at me. "The statute of limitations for insurance fraud is 7 years. My lawyers told me. It was 20 years ago. You cannot touch us for that. It is in the past. You cannot arrest us for something that happened 2 decades ago." He actually thought he had found a loophole. He actually believed he was smarter than the federal government and smarter than the daughter he had thrown away. He was clinging to a desperate technicality, hoping that the passage of time had magically washed the blood off his hands. I tapped my earpiece, looking at the sweating, terrified man who had abandoned me to freeze in an empty apartment. "You are right, Winston," I said, my voice cutting through his frantic babbling like a scalpel. "State-level insurance fraud does have a statute of limitations. If you had simply kept that $500,000 in a shoebox in Georgia, you might have gotten away with it. But you did not. You are greedy. You wanted to be a billionaire." Winston stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as the realization began to dawn on him. Federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft do not have the same convenient little loopholes when you continuously commit them, I explained, walking slowly around the edge of the table. "You used my stolen Social Security number across state lines to funnel that blood money into DeAndre's current hedge fund just last month. You did not just steal the money once, Winston. You kept moving it. You kept laundering it through digital networks. Every single time you moved that cash to prop up your golden boy, you committed a new federal crime. You crossed federal lines. You used federal banking wires. You handed the FBI a brand new conviction every single time you tried to hide your fake wealth." The sharp metallic click of handcuffs being unclipped from a tactical belt echoed through the room. The sound was louder than a bomb going off. Winston let out a strangled, breathless gasp as the nearest FBI agent grabbed his arm. The agent twisted it expertly behind his back and snapped the cold steel around his wrist. The harsh, ratcheting sound of the cuffs tightening made DeAndre scream from his place on the floor, pressing his hands over his ears, as if he could block out the reality of his doom. "Winston, your rights are being read to you," the agent stated calmly, spinning the large man around and forcefully marching him toward the glass doors. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Vivica watched her husband being shackled, and her mind finally completely shattered. The realization that she was about to be stripped of her designer clothes, her luxury home, and her freedom pushed her over the edge into total, unhinged hysteria. She saw the second agent stepping toward her with the cuffs ready. She did not try to run. She knew there was nowhere left to go. The elevator was locked. The stairs were guarded. Instead, she resorted to the only weapon she had ever successfully wielded against anyone in her entire life. She resorted to toxic maternal manipulation. She fell to the floor, landing hard on her knees. Her heavy gold bracelets clanked loudly against the wood as she threw her upper body forward, reaching her manicured hands out toward me. She dragged herself a few inches across the floor, sobbing so violently that her breath hitched in her throat. "Corinne," she wailed, her voice a horrific symphony of manufactured grief and desperate, vicious entitlement. "Corinne, please, you cannot do this to me. I am your mother. I carried you in my womb for 9 months. I gave you life. You came from my body. You are my daughter. You are sending your own flesh and blood to a federal prison." She was crying hysterically, her makeup running down her face in dark, muddy streaks, ruining her pristine image. She looked pathetic, a wealthy socialite reduced to begging on her knees. She actually believed that throwing the biological concept of motherhood in my face would suddenly erase the fact that she had buried a nameless child under my name just to cash a check. She thought the physical reality of my birth gave her a permanent free pass to destroy my existence without ever facing a single consequence. "You cannot do this to your own mother," Vivica screamed, pounding her fists against the floorboards. "God will punish you for this, Corinne. God sees what you are doing to the woman who gave you life, and he will strike you down for this betrayal. You owe me your life. You owe me respect. You cannot let them take me away in chains." The sheer depravity of her attempting to use God and morality to save herself from prison after committing identity theft and faking the death of her own child was almost beautiful in its insanity. She was trying to gaslight me one final time, trying to make me feel like the villain for simply handing her over to the justice system she had mocked for 2 decades. The FBI agent paused for a brief second, looking at me to see if I was going to intervene or if I was going to let the arrest proceed. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single drop of pity or hesitation. I looked at the weeping woman on the floor and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. The scared little girl who used to cry in the dark, wondering why her mommy did not love her, was completely gone. I walked slowly around the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards, until I was standing directly in front of her weeping form. I stopped right at the edge of her outstretched hands. I crouched down the fabric of my charcoal suit, pulling taut as I lowered myself to her level. I reached out my hand and gently grabbed her chin. My fingers were cold against her tear-soaked skin. I forced her head up, making her look directly at me. I looked deep into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. The eyes of the woman who had packed up a moving truck and driven away while I was sitting in a middle school classroom waiting for a ride home that would never come. The eyes of the woman who had gone to a morgue and looked at a decomposed child and smiled as she falsely identified the body as mine. "God already punished me, Mother," I whispered, my voice perfectly steady, smooth and utterly devoid of mercy. "He gave me you. Now it is your turn." I let go of her chin and stood up, turning my back on her as the FBI agent hauled her roughly to her feet. Vivica began to scream, a terrifying primal noise of absolute defeat as the handcuffs were snapped tightly around her wrists. She thrashed against the agent, but her struggles were useless against the trained federal investigator. Winston was weeping silently as he was led out the door, his head bowed in total shame. Richard slouched out behind them, flanked by an investigator, clutching his briefcase full of frozen assets. Sloane followed at a distance, refusing to look at DeAndre, refusing to look at me, simply staring blankly ahead as her entire world collapsed into ash. DeAndre was the last to be pulled from the floor. He did not fight. His legs simply refused to work, and the agents had to practically carry him out of the boardroom. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet my gaze. A shattered narcissist facing the reality of his own mediocrity and his impending prison sentence. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, sealing them all out of my sanctuary for the final time. The room was suddenly completely silent, save for the quiet humming of the projector screen, still displaying the map of their financial slaughter. Marcus walked over to the windows and pressed a button, returning the glass to its clear, transparent state. The bright Manhattan sunlight flooded back into the room, illuminating the scattered pearls, the torn legal documents, and the scuff marks on the floor. I walked over to the massive windows and looked out at the city below. The skyline stretched out for miles, an endless sea of glass and steel and power. They had tried to bury me in the dirt 20 years ago. They had tried to erase my name and use my ghost to build their perfect lives. But they had failed to realize that when you bury a seed in the dark, it does not die. It grows. It finds a way to break through the soil and reach the light. I had clawed my way out of the grave they dug for me, and I had built a kingdom on top of it. I took a deep breath, letting the clean, cool air fill my lungs, feeling an absolute, profound sense of peace. My name was Corinne, and I was finally exactly where I belonged. I turned slowly away from the glass, allowing the warmth of the afternoon sun to fade from my shoulders. The heavy mahogany doors had clicked shut, sealing out the hysterical screams of my mother and the pathetic weeping of my father. But the boardroom was not entirely empty. While the FBI agents had dragged the architects of my childhood misery into the corridor to face the reality of federal indictments, 2 financial investigators had remained behind. They stood like silent sentinels over the remaining wreckage of my so-called family. DeAndre was still curled on the floor near the base of the podium, his chest hitched with silent, dry sobs, his face pressed into the expensive woven fibers of the rug. Sloane was backed against the far wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, her eyes darting frantically between the door. Her ruined husband and the 2 federal agents who were now opening their heavy leather briefcases. The lead investigator, a tall man with a face carved out of granite, pulled a thick stack of manila folders from his bag. He did not look at them with pity or malice or triumph. He looked at them the way a sanitation worker looks at trash that needs to be cleared away. His movements were precise and methodical as he separated the folders and dropped them onto the conference table right next to the scattered pearls from Sloane's broken necklace. DeAndre Wilson, the investigator, said, his voice entirely devoid of human emotion. "You are hereby served with immediate notice of federal asset forfeiture and receivership." DeAndre flinched at the sound of his name, but he did not look up. He kept his face hidden as if ignoring the investigator would make the nightmare stop. The investigator did not care if DeAndre was looking. He simply continued reading from the top sheet of the document, his words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. "As of this exact moment, every financial account bearing your name, your social security number, or the tax identification numbers of your associated hedge funds has been frozen by the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice," the investigator stated. "This includes your primary checking accounts, your offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands, your investment portfolios, and the family trust you illegally managed. You have 0 available liquid assets." Sloane let out a sharp, trembling breath, her eyes widening in absolute horror. Her hands flew to her mouth as she stared at the federal agent. Furthermore, the investigator continued turning the page. "Every piece of real property purchased with the illicitly obtained funds has been seized by the federal government. This includes the penthouse in Manhattan, the vacation property in Aspen, and the fleet of vehicles registered to your holding company. Your access cards and electronic keys have already been deactivated by the building management at your residence. DeAndre finally lifted his head. His face was swollen and red, his eyes completely bloodshot. He looked like a child who had just been told the sun was never going to rise again. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his hands shaking violently as he gripped the edge of the conference table. "You are not under physical arrest at this exact moment," the second investigator added, stepping forward. "But you are under strict federal surveillance. You have exactly 1 hour to return to the Manhattan penthouse under the supervision of a federal escort. You will be allowed to pack a single bag of personal items consisting only of basic clothing and essential toiletries. You are strictly forbidden from taking any jewelry, art electronics, or luxury items purchased with the laundered funds. If you attempt to remove any seized assets from the premises, you will be immediately taken into federal custody for obstruction and theft of government property. Your 1 hour window begins right now." The investigators placed the foreclosure and eviction notices on the table and snapped their briefcases shut. They did not offer any further explanation or comfort. They simply turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the documents resting on the polished wood. Sloane moved before DeAndre even had a chance to process the words. She pushed herself away from the wall, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she marched toward the table. She did not look at the documents. She looked down at the pathetic, weeping man she had married. The realization of her new reality had completely rewired her brain in a matter of seconds. Sloane had been born into generational wealth. She had been raised to expect nothing less than absolute luxury and total immunity from the struggles of normal people. She had married DeAndre because he was the golden boy, because he had promised her an empire, because he fit perfectly into the pristine, wealthy narrative of her life. Looking at him now, covered in dust and tears, stripped of every single dollar he had ever claimed to own, she felt nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. "You lied to me!" Sloane hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You told me you built that fund yourself. You told me you were a genius. You told my father you were a safe investment." DeAndre reached a shaking hand up toward her, his eyes pleading for comfort. "Sloane, please." He croaked, his voice raw and pathetic. "Please do not do this right now. I need you. We need to figure this out. We have a baby coming. We need to stick together." Sloane let out a laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "Stick together," she repeated, stepping back so his reaching hand grasped nothing but empty air. "Are you insane, DeAndre? Do you honestly think I am going to stand by you while the federal government liquidates my life? Do you think I am going to raise my child in a prison waiting room while you serve 20 years for wire fraud? You are nothing. You are a fraud who built a life on stolen money, and you dragged my family down with you." She reached for her left hand and aggressively pulled the massive diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band off her finger. The diamonds caught the light of the projector screen as she threw them down onto the conference table. The heavy rings clattered against the wood, sliding across the foreclosure notices and coming to a stop near the edge of the table. "I am going to my father's lawyers," Sloane stated, her voice entirely devoid of any love or loyalty she had ever claimed to possess. "I am filing for divorce, and I am filing for full protective custody of this child. Do not ever try to contact me again. You do not exist to me anymore." She did not wait for a response. She spun around on her heel, her torn couture dress swirling around her legs, and stormed out of the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind her, leaving a suffocating silence in her wake. She had abandoned him with the exact same ruthless efficiency that he had abandoned me 20 years ago. The symmetry of the universe was a beautiful, terrifying thing to witness. DeAndre remained on his knees, staring blankly at the diamond rings resting on top of his eviction notice. His breathing was shallow and fast, bordering on hyperventilation. The golden child, the pride of the Wilson family, the brilliant hedge fund manager, had been reduced to absolutely nothing in less than 30 minutes. His parents were in federal custody. His father-in-law was indicted. His wife had discarded him like a broken toy. His fortune was completely gone. His home was seized. His cars were impounded. He was entirely alone in a world he no longer owned or understood. Marcus stood quietly near the entrance, his presence a solid, unmoving wall of security. I remained perfectly still behind the podium, watching the complete psychological collapse of the boy who had stolen my life. I did not feel angry anymore. The burning rage that had sustained me through the freezing nights on the streets of Atlanta, through the hunger and the fear and the desperate struggle to survive, had entirely burned out. It had been replaced by a cold, clinical peace. DeAndre slowly turned his head. His neck moved stiffly as if the weight of his own skull was too much to bear. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, round, and completely broken. The arrogant light that usually danced in his pupils had been permanently extinguished. He was looking at me, not as a sister, but as a terrifying force of nature that had just wiped his existence off the map. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked around the massive, beautiful boardroom, taking in the sweeping views of the city skyline, the expensive leather chairs, the polished marble. He was standing in the very heart of the empire I had built, while he was spending my blood money on champagne and bespoke suits. The contrast between my power and his absolute helplessness was finally fully apparent to him. "Corinne," he whispered, his voice so weak it barely carried across the distance between us. I did not answer. I simply watched him, letting him drown in the silence, letting the reality of his situation press down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He raised his hands, looking at his shaking palms as if he did not recognize them. He looked at his ruined suit. He looked back at the doors where his wife had just disappeared. Panic. A deep, primal animal. Panic began to set in as the logistical reality of his situation finally breached his shock. "Corinne," he said again, his voice pitching upward as tears began to fall from his eyes once more. "I do not have my car. My accounts are frozen." Sloan left me. He pushed himself up from his knees, stumbling slightly as his expensive leather shoes slipped on the floor. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the dark leather. His chest was heaving, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. He was a man who had never had to survive a single day in the real world. He had never checked a bank balance before buying dinner. He had never worried about making rent. He had never had to figure out how to transport himself from one place to another without a private driver or a luxury vehicle. And now he was standing in the middle of Manhattan with literally $0 to his name. "How am I supposed to get home?" he asked, the tears spilling over his cheeks and dripping off his chin. His voice was a pathetic, broken plea. "How am I supposed to get home, Corinne? They are taking the apartment in an hour. I do not even know how to get there. My phone is disabled because it is on the company account. I do not have a credit card that works. I do not have any cash. How am I supposed to live?" He was weeping openly now, his face contorted in an ugly mask of pure terror. He was begging the sister he had left for dead to save him from the consequences of his own horrific greed. He wanted me to solve his problem. He wanted me to fix the reality that he had broken. I looked at him, and I remembered a cold, rainy night in Georgia. I remembered sitting on the floor of a dark, empty apartment, watching the headlights of my parents' car sweep across the living room wall as they drove away and abandoned me. I remembered the gnawing pain of hunger in my stomach. I remembered the absolute paralyzing fear of realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me had left me to die so they could steal my future. I remembered asking the exact same questions he was asking now. How am I supposed to live? I stepped away from the podium. My heels clicked softly against the floorboards as I closed the distance between us. DeAndre flinched as I approached, but he did not back away. He stayed frozen, gripping the back of the leather chair, staring at me with a mixture of terror and pathetic, desperate hope. He actually thought I might help him. He actually thought that despite everything I had just done to destroy him, I might reach out a hand and pull him back from the ledge. I stopped a few feet in front of him. I did not smile. I did not offer any words of comfort. I looked into his weeping, bloodshot eyes, and I reached into the inner pocket of my perfectly tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the smooth, crisp paper I had been carrying with me for this exact moment. I had kept it perfectly preserved, waiting for the day when the universe would finally demand a balancing of the scales. I pulled out something small and green. I held the small green rectangle of paper between my thumb and forefinger, letting the stark overhead lighting illuminate its worn surface. It was an old $50 bill creased and softened at the edges. The portrait of Grant faded from decades of being kept in a plastic sleeve inside a lockbox. It was the exact same piece of currency Winston and Vivica had left on the kitchen counter of that freezing Atlanta apartment 20 years ago. The literal price they had placed on my life. The severance package they had deemed adequate for a discarded 12-year-old girl. I had never spent it. I had carried it with me through foster homes, through night shifts, at all-night diners, through college libraries where I slept at the desks, and eventually into corporate boardrooms. It had been my fuel. It was the physical manifestation of my abandonment, and I had forged it into a weapon. DeAndre stared at the bill, uncomprehending. His brain was too fractured by the sudden violent loss of his millions to understand the significance of a single $50 note. He let out another wet, pathetic sob, reaching his hand out toward me as if I were offering him a lifeline rather than a tombstone. His fingers were shaking violently, the expensive fine wool fabric of his custom suit sleeve stained with tears and mucus and dust from the floor. He looked so small, so entirely stripped of the golden boy persona that had insulated him from the real world his entire life. I stepped closer until the tips of my leather shoes were almost touching his trembling knees. I reached down and took his shaking hand in mine. His skin was clammy and cold, slick with the sweat of a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse into a black hole. I did not flinch away from his touch. I simply turned his hand over, forcing his palm open. His fingers curled instinctively, wanting to hold on to something, wanting to grasp at any remaining shred of his former life, but I pressed them flat against my palm. My hand was perfectly steady, a stark contrast to his violent trembling. With slow, deliberate precision, I placed the crumpled $50 bill into the center of his palm. I folded his trembling fingers over it, wrapping his hand into a tight fist around the worn paper. I squeezed his fist shut, sealing the transaction. He looked down at his closed hand, and then up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the confusion briefly cutting through his absolute panic. He did not understand. He was waiting for the catch, waiting for me to pull out a checkbook or offer a wire transfer to a hidden offshore account. He was still waiting for the golden child treatment that had defined every single moment of his spoiled, stolen existence. He fundamentally believed that he was too important to fall. I leaned down slightly, my face inches from his. My voice was quiet, but it carried the crushing weight of 2 decades of vengeance finally being delivered. It was a whisper that drowned out every other sound in the world. New York is a tough city. DeAndre, I whispered softly, letting the words fall between us like a physical blow. You will figure it out. Those were the exact words scrawled on the yellow sticky note left beside this very same bill 20 years ago. The final careless dismissal from a mother and father who had decided I was no longer a necessary part of their family portfolio. I watched the recognition slowly dawn in DeAndre's eyes. He knew the story. He knew exactly how they had abandoned me. He had heard them joke about it behind closed doors when they thought no one was listening, celebrating their cleverness and shedding dead weight. He knew exactly what that note had said. The realization of what was happening finally broke through his shock. The absolute poetic symmetry of his destruction shattered his last remaining sliver of hope. There would be no mercy. There would be no family loyalty to exploit. There would be no secret trust fund to save him. He was being cast out into the freezing reality of the world with exactly the same resources they had given me. $50 and a goodbye. He let out a sound that I could only describe as a dying gasp. It was a horrible wrenching noise that scraped against the walls of the boardroom. He collapsed forward completely, his forehead pressing against the cold marble floor, his fist still tightly clutching the $50 bill. He was weeping so hard he was choking on his own breath, his body convulsing with the pure agony of total absolute loss. The reality of his impending homelessness and federal prison sentence was finally crushing his chest. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The sight of him broken and crawling on the floor of my empire brought me a profound, deep satisfaction that settled comfortably into my bones. The scales were finally balanced. The ghosts of my past had been dragged into the light and completely eradicated. The trauma that had haunted my shadows had been weaponized and returned to its rightful owners. I turned my back on him. The movement was fluid, absolute, and final. I walked away from the weeping ruin of my brother, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic march across the floorboards. I walked past the empty chairs where the arrogant titans of industry had sat just an hour ago, past the projector screens still displaying the digital map of his financial slaughter. I walked directly to my massive oak desk at the far end of the penthouse. I did not look back. I reached across the polished surface of the desk and pressed the silver button on my intercom system. My finger was perfectly steady. "Security?" I said, my voice echoing clearly through the speaker filling the massive room. "Please escort this man out of my building." DeAndre did not fight them. His legs dragged uselessly against the expensive rug as they carried him toward the exit. His expensive shoes scuffed against the marble. He was still sobbing uncontrollably, his shoulders heaving, clutching the $50 bill to his chest like a frightened child holding a security blanket. His weeping echoed down the long hallway, a pathetic fading soundtrack to the absolute end of the Wilson family legacy. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut with a solid, definitive click. The sound severed the last remaining tie I had to the people who had tried to destroy me. The click was the sound of a heavy vault sealing permanently. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not just the absence of noise. It was a beautiful, heavy tranquility that completely filled the vast space of the penthouse. The toxic energy, the arrogance, the entitlement that my family had brought into the room had been entirely vacuumed out, leaving behind an atmosphere of pure, crystalline peace. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. The physical space of the penthouse felt cleansed, sterilized of their infection. I walked slowly away from my desk, moving toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that spanned the entire length of the eastern wall. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light across the endless expanse of the Manhattan skyline. The skyscrapers reached up like glass monuments to power and resilience capturing the fading light. Millions of people were moving through the tough city far below, fighting their own battles, building their own lives. I had conquered this city. I had conquered my past. I had built a fortress that no one could ever tear down. My phone buzzed gently on the mahogany desk behind me, breaking the perfect silence with a soft vibration. I turned and picked it up, glancing at the glowing screen. It was an email notification. It was not from a wealth manager or a corporate lawyer or a federal investigator finalizing the asset seizures. It was an email from the director of the International Orphanage Foundation that I had been heavily funding for the past 3 years in total secrecy. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the text. The director was writing to inform me that the construction of the new educational wing and the central library had been completely finished a month ahead of schedule. She was thanking me profusely, her words filled with genuine, overwhelming gratitude. She wrote that the resources I had provided were going to fundamentally change the trajectories of hundreds of abandoned children. They were going to have books and computers and warm beds, and most importantly, they were going to have a chance. A chance that I had been forced to carve out of stone for myself when I was left with nothing but a $50 bill. A genuine soft smile finally touched my lips. It reached my eyes, softening the cold edges that had defined my face for the past hour. The contrast was perfect, poetic, and entirely by design. While my biological family was being stripped of their stolen wealth, their luxury cars, and their freedom, and marched into federal holding cells, I was using the massive empire I had built to protect the children who had been left behind in the dark, just like I was. The wealth they had hoarded for their own vanity and greed was now going to fund the futures of the forgotten. I was turning the poison of my past into medicine for someone else. I set the phone down gently and walked over to the small coffee station near the corner of the office. I poured myself a fresh cup, the dark, rich liquid steaming in the cool air of the penthouse. I picked up the delicate ceramic cup, feeling the comforting warmth radiating against my palms, soothing the lingering tension in my muscles. I walked back to the massive windows, taking a slow, deep sip of the dark roast coffee. The bitter, complex flavor grounded me in the present moment, waking up my senses. I looked out over the sprawling empire of glass and concrete, the golden hour light reflecting in the windows of the neighboring towers, painting the city in shades of fire and gold. I could see my own reflection in the glass, a faint shadow standing tall and unbroken against the magnificent backdrop of the city. The skyline was reflecting perfectly in my eyes, mirroring the vastness of the world I now controlled. 20 years ago, I was a disposable asset, a nameless ghost shivering in an empty apartment with a green piece of paper and a cruel sticky note. Today, I was the orchestrator of my own justice, the architect of my own massive empire, and the absolute final authority on my own life. The storm had completely passed. The scales were permanently balanced. There was absolutely nothing left in the room but the ultimate absolute peace of justice, perfectly served. The greatest lesson to learn from this journey is that true security never comes from forced family loyalty or seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. True power is found in complete independence and the quiet strength it takes to walk away from toxic environments. You cannot heal in the exact same place that broke you. Building your own empire requires leaving the ruins of their expectations behind. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own life, please share your story in the comments below.